there's a common misconception that carbon farming is just about creating and trading credits, and that's largely due to industries like mining or oil and gas needing and relying on agriculture to offset their emissions. Sure, there's a space for credits, and that's a big part of the conversation. However, it's not the whole conversation, and we'll touch on the implications of this a little bit more next week. Of course, credits are going to be woven throughout the entire conversation, but we'll look more at the safeguard mechanism and the implications for big companies and why they need credits to keep continuing operation. But for producers, carbon farming is and always has been about how you manage the carbon that's already part of your production system. At the heart of it, carbon farming is about what agriculture has always done, managing and optimizing photosynthesis, growing plants and building biomass either to feed livestock or to grow a crop. So if you look at this image here, it shows exactly how that cycle works in a grazing system. AI's interpretation of mulga trees and blue bush is a little skew with, but we'll roll with it. Hopefully it makes it a little bit more relevant for us in the rangelands, but you get the picture. So as we can see from this image, carbon is constantly cycling through the agricultural system in different forms, one form or another. It starts with the plants, which take in carbon dioxide and sunlight energy, and they use that to turn it into a form of sugar, which fuels growth. That sugar moves through the system down through the soil, but livestock also graze the plants, and some of that carbon that the livestock graze is immediately absorbed by the animal. And that's either moved off and eaten by me, who really loves a nice steak, or worn when I put on a woolen jumper, or when the animal dies, it returns back to the earth and cycles through the soil. Some of it also returns when the animal produces manure and through plant residues. Microbes then go to work and they break down the material, releasing nutrients that feed new growth. So those nutrients become available for plant uptake, and then also in that process, some is released back to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. And the whole thing really just keeps turning and transforming and moving carbon from the atmosphere to the plants, to the animals, to soil, and back again. That's the natural carbon cycle, and it's been powering production for millions of years. It's not a new thing at all. Where carbon leaves the system, and although the carbon cycle is mostly a closed system, there are a couple ways that carbon leaves in one form or another, as I briefly touched on before. Some of it leaves when the animal is sold off the property and moved off the property. Essentially, the carbon cycle that was happening in this location, it just continues in a different location, right? So as it goes to the market and is processed, it just continues the cycle in a different place. It also means that there's a loss to the soil of that carbon that would have naturally returned back. The other main pathway is through methane, which I'm sure you all have heard about before. We'll briefly touch on it because, like I said, this whole first webinar assumes is introductory knowledge. So methane is produced when livestock digest their feed. During digestion or rumination, microbes in the animal's stomach, particularly in the rumen, break down fibrous plant materials and that matter that they couldn't otherwise break down. As part of that process, the microbes release methane as a natural byproduct, and the animal then burps it back out into the atmosphere. Some of it is farted out, but it's mostly burped. So we'll clear that one up, but we can keep saying farted out to the atmosphere because I think it's funny. So this process, known as enteric fermentation, that rumination process, has been part of the carbon cycle for tens of millions of years. This is not a new phenomenon. Long before agriculture even existed. It's a completely natural function of ruminant animals like cattle and sheep and goats, and it allows them to convert pasture into energy and protein. As I'm sure you're all aware, methane gets a lot of attention, but it's important to remember that this process is in no way new and has long been a part of the carbon cycle. We'll look at this more in detail in the next webinar, but for now, keep in mind that while there are ways to reduce emissions through better feed quality, improved genetics, and greater production efficiency, We're really not aiming for net zero methane emissions in grazing systems. What you can do is lower methane losses relative to productivity, and that often goes hand in hand with a more efficient, more profitable operation. So reducing those losses isn't just about carbon, it's also good for business, and that should stay the priority. So when we talk about carbon farming, just to bring it back full circle, we're really talking about capturing and using carbon more efficiently, improving productivity while reducing losses. The more carbon we can store and recycle within our systems, the healthier our soils, the more resilient our pastures, the more feed for our animals, the quicker we can fatten our cows or sheep or whatever you're running, and the stronger our bottom line. At the end of the day, carbon farming isn't something new or separate. It's just another way of describing what producers already do every single day, manage carbon well to keep their country healthy and their business productive. Right, okay, so let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Why does all this matter beyond the property gate? Yeah, what's the big deal? We're going to be looking at policy and definitions and processes for a lot of the rest of this webinar, not the entire thing, and I apologize that it might be a little bit slow going, but bear with me. As I said before, we really need to understand this to form context. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge that some of you have heard this before, and yeah, so to understand carbon and why it's such a big deal for pastoral systems, we also need to understand the greenhouse gas effect, because that's really what's driving all attention to policies and carbon programs we're seeing today, like me giving this webinar. So the greenhouse effect. You've probably all heard of it before. That's what this diagram here is showing. If you look on the left-hand side of the diagram, this is showing the natural process of the greenhouse effect. The sun sends heat down to Earth in the form of solar radiation, and straight away, most of it is actually bounced back to space. It's reflected back into space. Greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, they form a blanket around, essentially like a blanket, and they trap some of those greenhouse gases within the atmosphere. They trap some of the heat, within the atmosphere, which then keeps the Earth warm. Without these greenhouse gases and without this effect, our planet is far too cold to support the systems that we rely on. But if you look over to the right-hand side of the diagram, and this is where we can see what's changed. Human activity, like burning coal, oil, and gas, clearing vegetation, and running heavy industry has added a lot more greenhouse gases to that blanket. So instead of one comfortable layer, we've now piled on extra quilts, meaning less heat escapes into space. If we think back to the carbon cycle that we were just looking at, it helps us to picture what's happening globally, though the global scale is a lot bigger. Carbon still moves through the air and the plants and the soil, but the difference now is how fast it's moving, and that's the key takeaway. In a well-functioning agriculture system, carbon moves through the cycle steadily, relatively slowly. Plants capture carbon dioxide, animals eat the plant, microbes recycle the waste, and some carbon returns back to the atmosphere. It's slow, it's balanced, and it keeps things in check. But when we burn fossil fuels, we're taking carbon that's been locked underground for millions of years, ancient plant and animal material, and releasing it all at once back into the atmosphere. So instead of that slow, steady flow that happens over millions of years, we've opened the tap wide and let it all happen at once. As a result, now far more carbon is being released than the system can naturally cycle back down at a reasonable rate. And at the same time, clearing vegetation has reduced the planet's ability to draw that carbon back in through photosynthesis. So globally, the problem isn't agriculture itself. It's that we've dug up and re-released carbon from long-term storage while also reducing nature's capacity to take it back out of the air. That's essentially what's happening with carbon on a global scale. We've taken too much out too quickly and weakened the system's ability to recover. The result, more heat is trapped than and that's what's driving climate change. So shifting rainfall patterns, longer dry spells, warmer average temperatures across the landscape. When we talk about reducing emissions to ease the effects of climate change, this is what we mean. Finding ways to ease off the extra insulation that we see here to ease these effects. And while carbon is the biggest contributor, gases like methane and nitrous oxide, both relevant in livestock and grazing systems, also play a role. So I like to talk about this because not all greenhouse gases behave the same way. So if carbon dioxide is a big deal, why do we hear so much about methane? It's a lot about methane for us, hey? And when we talk about carbon, whether that's carbon emissions, carbon farming, or carbon markets, we're typically referring to a mix of greenhouse gases, most commonly carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Each of these gases has different characteristics. Some trap more heat and some linger in the atmosphere for a much longer time, like carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for up to 1,000 years, whereas methane only hangs around for 12 to 20 years, and nitrous oxide hangs around for around 100 years. So to make sense of that, we use a measure called the global warming potential, or GWP, and that's what we're seeing up here. It compares how much heat each gas traps over a set period. If you look on the screen, that's what these number means. Carbon dioxide, that's our baseline, it's 1. Whereas methane, it traps about 28 times more heat than carbon dioxide does over a 20-year period. Nitrous oxide, on the other hand, it's quite strong. It traps 264 times more heat than carbon dioxide, and it stays for about a century as well. So while there's much less methane and nitrous oxide overall, they pack a much bigger punch in the short term. And it's worth acknowledging here that this measurement it's really an evolving measurement. It's not foolproof, and it has been subject to a lot of debate, but it's the measurement we have right now, and it's what we work off. I won't be surprised to see if this changes in the coming years, but we'll see what happens. And so this is where the carbon dioxide equivalent comes in. It's a way to put all greenhouse gases on the same scale so we can measure and compare their total impact. So for example, 1 ton of methane is equivalent to 28 tons of carbon dioxide, and 1 ton of nitrous oxide is equivalent to 264 tons of carbon dioxide. I've prompted myself here to say that 3 times fast. So this helps explain why methane attracts so much attention. It's short-lived but powerful, and reductions have a fast impact. If methane emissions are cut today, the climate benefits are felt within a decade, even while we continue to tackle long-term carbon dioxide emissions. So just to slam home the point, this chart from the Net Zero Australia plan, it's just been released in September this year. This shows the share of methane emissions by sector. You can see agriculture, it accounts for around 51% of national methane emissions, and a lot of that comes from ruminant livestock. That number, it can sound confronting, and it can prickle people up. I certainly get a little pricked up by it as well. But it's important to keep it in perspective. As we discussed before, methane from ruminant livestock, it's biogenic. It's part of the natural carbon cycle. So it's produced as a normal part of digestion when cattle and sheep convert pasture into energy. And it's very different from industrial or resource sector methane, which often comes from fossil fuel extraction or leaks during mining and energy production. These are emissions that release long-stored carbon back into the atmosphere. So reducing methane from livestock, it isn't simple. Feed additives, improved genetics, and better production efficiencies are a way to do so, but eliminating methane altogether just isn't realistic for grazing systems. By contrast, other sectors like coal, gas, and waste management have clearer technical fixes for cutting methane losses quickly. So later on, we'll explore, I think we're going to do it. Oh no. Sorry, pardon me. Later on, we're going to explore how Australia's net zero targets and the lifting of the carbon neutral 30 are shifting national priorities and balancing emissions reductions with food security, productivity, and resilience in agriculture. And from the last times that I've kind of delivered these presentations, that seemed to be a real concern for producers. So hopefully this is a bit of a good news story through line from this presentation. So we've talked about why methane gets so much attention globally. Now let's look at where that focus comes from. And these international agreements are shaping how countries, including Australia, respond to climate change and driving the global push towards net zero. So I need to outline, what do we mean when we say net zero emissions? Put simply, net zero means achieving a balance between the greenhouse gases that we put into the atmosphere versus the greenhouse gases that we absorb back or offset. In other words, it's when emissions and removals even out with no overall increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases. So who's asking for this? Who's behind the global push for low emissions and net zero targets? Well, it comes down, the short answer is that it's happening at a global scale with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. I'll say it again a few times throughout this presentation, but it is a mouthful, that's for sure. This treaty was established to coordinate international efforts to tackle climate change, and it's a foundation for all major climate agreements that followed, including the Kyoto Protocol and the landmark Paris Agreement, which we're going to address a little bit more in the next slide. So today, the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, has 198 parties, basically every country, and the European Union, making it one of the most widely ratified treaties in the world. So the UNFCCC, I'm not going to say it again, it's up there, draws on scientific assessments from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This really is a government talk. We've got all the synonyms, anyway, or the IPCC, which is the UN scientific body that reports on what's happening in the climate system and what the future could look like. So why all the urgency? It feels like we've heard a lot about targets. There's a lot of urgency in the push to net zero. So according to the last IPCC assessment report, the one that's just on your screen here, the 6th assessment report, if global warming continues at the current rate, climate risks will become more complex and harder to manage. That means challenges for food production, for water availability and supply chains, especially as drought, land competition, and even global conflict put extra pressure on those systems. So when we talk about climate targets, it's not just about reducing emissions in cities or factories. It's also about maintaining global food security and supporting sustainable land use. That's where agriculture and especially grazing systems come into the picture. So like I said, the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, in 2015, nearly every country that was a part of the UNFCCC, 195 parties signed on to the Paris Agreement at COP21 in Paris. So COP means Conference of Parties. It's basically where these guys meet every single year, Australia included. And it's a legally binding treaty on climate change built around one clear goal, and that is to reach a balance between what we emit and what we remove, in other words, to achieve net zero by 2050. Since then, over 190 countries have set emissions reduction targets, and around 165 nations, representing around 80% of the world's GDP, have pledged to reach net zero. So the world is now on a clear and largely irreversible path towards a low carbon future, is essentially what this agreement has kind of told us. We're nearly through the policy, I promise. So the Glasgow Climate Pact, COP26, this was another one of their meetings. They got together in 2021 and they reaffirmed the goals of the Paris Agreement. And essentially they recognized that what was happening, it wasn't happening at a fast enough rate. There needed to be more action to reach net zero by 2050. They weren't going to reach it in time. So interim goals was what came as a result of that. So nations agreed, including Australia, to strengthen their 2030 targets, phase down coal and tackle methane emissions head on through the launch of the Global Methane Pledge. We'll get there in a second. The pact called on all countries to present stronger national action plans or nationally determined contributions. This is important. This is kind of what governs our pathway to net zero. And these NDCs, nationally determined contributions, outline how they'll cut emissions to adapt to climate impacts. So under the Paris Agreement and legislated through the Climate Change Act 2020, there's Scott Morrison at Glasgow 2021, Australia has pledged to, and we can see it highlighted here, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% below 2005 levels by 2030, and reach net zero emissions by 2050. As I said, as a part of the Glasgow Climate Pact, Australia also joined the Global Methane Pledge, which committed to work towards a 30% reduction in methane emissions below 2020 levels by 2030. There's a lot of years in this whole policy world. And this connects directly to what we discussed earlier about methane's short lifetime and high warming potential. Because methane is such a powerful short-lived gas, reducing it offers one of the quickest ways to slow global warming, which is why it's become such a focus in both policy and research. The global methane pledge it's not a legal requirement, but it does set a strong global signal. It shapes research investment, carbon markets, and the direction of new technology across the agriculture sector. So it naturally leads on to the goal that MLA and the Red Meat Australia set back in 2017, carbon neutral 30. I appreciate that a lot of you would know what this is, but if you don't, it's essentially when MLA and Red Meat Australia came together and said, look, we want to be carbon neutral by 2030. And I think it's worth noting that this was a highly ambitious goal, especially considering that, you know, the industry doesn't need to be carbon neutral by 2030. Like the global methane pledge said, it was only 30% less methane emissions by 2030. So yeah, it wasn't a hard deadline. The global methane pledge was, yeah, like I said, whoops, I've just said everything I wanted to say. That's good, I know my stuff. In many ways, it worked. Since 2005, emissions from the red meat sector have dropped by around 78%, largely due to reduced land clearing and improved management. But hitting full carbon neutrality across such a large and diverse industry has proven really tough. Carbon Neutral 30 helped shine a light on just how complex this challenge is. Tens of thousands of producers, millions of animals, and massive rangeland areas that are hard to even measure precisely. So simultaneously, the rest of the world also showed their pathway to low methane future. Brazil is already marketing carbon neutral beef into the EU, kind of similar to what we see happening at Coles with Coles Finest. That's a carbon neutral brand. New Zealand has legislated its farm emissions framework, and even the US states like California have methane reduction targets, despite Trump's involvement, all aligning with the global methane pledge. Graham, I saw you chuckle there. So while the politics vary, the direction is the same. Every major agriculture nation is moving towards measurable, verifiable emissions reduction. And so recognizing this, Meat and Livestock Australia recently updated its approach and basically stepped away from this target. They've kind of said that their intention is to keep improving R&D and to support net zero by 2050. However, they haven't said that Red Meat Australia is aiming for this anymore. So Michael Crowley, who is the managing director of MLA, he described it as this for the reasoning of doing that. Productivity and profitability will underpin sustainability and prosperity in our industry. And so that's why they've stepped away. We're looking for more research into how we reduce emissions and making it tangible on property. So last policy slide, international policy slide, let's bring it back to us. So I'm not sure if you guys were aware or you saw in the Stock Journal, but at the end of September, just last month, I think it was, nearly last month, November tomorrow, Australia released a new 2035 target, a new nationally determined contribution, which sets the country's updated roadmap to net zero. So the target that they have set is to be 62 to 70% less emissions by 2035, moving towards 2050. So it's also worth noting that Australia is bidding to host COP31 in 2026, one of those conference of parties like I discussed, which would be a major opportunity to demonstrate global leadership on climate and reaffirm our commitments to a credible, achievable path to net zero. So this seems like a pretty lofty goal, and we've got a lot of targets in place as a nation, and we're reaffirming our real commitment to net zero despite what Barnaby Joyce has been saying. But what does this mean for agriculture? Like we discussed, there's been a lot of eyeballs on ag, particularly the livestock industry, in the last kind of 10 to 15 years to reduce methane. So what does this mean for us? Does it mean that we're going to have more, are we going to have a carbon tax? Are we going to have more eyeballs? Let's talk about it. So The government has been clear that agriculture won't be asked to carry the burden for other sectors, and that food and fibre security must come first. Of course, methane reduction remains a key focus, and there's a lot of money that's gone into research and development to support practical on-property solutions, including the methane emissions reduction in livestock program, which has had an investment of $29 million. Into feed additives and forage legumes like Asparagopsis, seaweed, and 3NOP, and the Zero Net Emissions Agricultural Cooperative Research Centre, which launched last year with an $87 million investment in federal funding. This is a 10-year investment, so it'll be interesting to see how this goes and what comes as a result of it. So, and importantly, these initiatives are about reducing emissions intensity, which we'll touch on in a little bit, not reducing overall herd numbers. Notably, the plan also recognises limited abatement options in extensive grazing operations. These are goals for emissions reduction in agriculture, but primarily to do with measurable, achievable outcomes like fertiliser use or solar use, and not emissions reduction from enteric fermentation. The focus remains on better emissions tracking, stronger supply chain partnerships, and innovation that boosts productivity and market access. So how does this national target play out across the economy, and what does it look like for sectors like ag as we move forward toward 2050? Let's look at those projections. So this graph, it demonstrates how net zero will be reached across different sectors in the economy. If you look here, each colour represents a different sector, and agriculture is in this green band in the middle. The darker section below, that represents the carbon removals like soil carbon, vegetation growth, and other sequestration processes. The green dashed line through the middle, that's the net zero line. Now you can see that emissions are expected to decline across all sectors, and ag is expected to decline a little bit, but not that much comparatively. That's not because agriculture isn't part of the solution. It's actually really a big part of the solution. It's because the sector operates differently, like we discussed. You can't just switch off an animal producing methane. It's just not possible, and the tech isn't advanced enough. So instead of aiming for zero, the agriculture pathway focuses on reducing methane emissions intensity. We'll touch on that soon. That is producing the same or more output with lower emissions per unit. So we'll look at emissions intensity closely next, like I just said. And as always, the government is relying on the agriculture sector to generate land-based carbon credits for offsets. We'll be exploring the complexities of that in the next webinar. So the message here is this. Australia's 2035 target gives us a clear direction of travel, one that combines emissions reduction with productivity, innovation, and sustainable land use. For ag, it's not about cutting production, it's about optimizing our systems, just like we talked about at the start of the webinar, and just like you guys are used to doing in your everyday business activities. So I just want to quote the National Farmers Federation Interim Chief Executive, Sue Mikulski. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm sure one of you know and will let me know. She has said that it's encouraging to see government policy recognise that it cannot be net zero for agriculture, and that productive agricultural land should never be sacrificed to offset emissions from other industries. Right. We're moving down the funnel. We're getting a little bit more relevant. So we've looked at some big policies. So let's start to narrow in on what this looks like in your playing field. So government and global policies are one thing, but how has your supply chain responded to all of this? As we know, it's really industry and consumers that drive the market. So what does that look like in your world? How are processors, retailers, and brands responding to these targets, and what does it mean for producers on the ground? Before we move into how these policies flow through, it's important that we all have a shared understanding of two key terms that keep coming up: carbon footprint and emissions intensity. So these two ideas underpin how emissions are measured, reported, and managed, not just at the national level, but on property and across the entire value chain. So let's start with the carbon footprint. At its simplest, your carbon footprint is your net emissions, the total amount of greenhouse gases your business releases, minus what you capture or offset. So when we talk about calculating or measuring your carbon footprint, what we're really doing is adding up all the emissions that come from your production system, energy use, livestock, maybe fertilizer if you have a mixed enterprise, fuel, waste, and then subtracting the carbon you store through vegetation, soils, or other sequestration projects. We are looking at calculators and tools to measure these a little bit more in depth next week, but I will just say that accurately managing stored carbon is quite challenging, and we'll kind of look into the complexities of that next week. So the purpose of understanding your carbon footprint isn't just about compliance, it's about preparing for reporting requirements up the value chain. So not reporting that you own, but perhaps who you supply to owns. Knowing your footprint also gives you a baseline, a starting point. You can use it as a management tool to identify where emissions are coming from and where efficiency gains can be made, and to track process over time. So the second term, and probably the more important out of the two, so if you've zoned out, come and have a look back at this one. Emissions intensity, this is probably more important. So emissions intensity measures the rate of emissions relative to production. In other words, it's how much greenhouse gases produce for each unit of output. For example, the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent produced per kilogram of beef, or per litre of milk, or per tonne of grain. This measure is incredibly useful because it links emissions directly to productivity. It kind of tells the story of, how your product is being produced relative to emissions output. And yeah, it's a powerful tool for producers to demonstrate improvements, and not just by reducing net emissions, but also by producing more efficiently. So it allows you, so it's not all just about reducing stock numbers, it's also about how well your stock are performing. So if you're able to grow the same or greater amount of product with fewer emissions per unit, like I just kind of outlined, your emissions intensity improves even if total emissions stay roughly the same. For your supply chain, this is the number that is going to matter the most, and that's exactly where the industry is heading, towards systems that are productive, efficient, and carbon aware without compromising output or food security. So to summarize the two terms, carbon footprint tells us how much we emit overall. It's our big number. And emissions intensity tells us how efficiently we're producing. Understanding both will be critical as supply chains increasingly require transparent and verifiable emissions data. We'll look into the complexity of that in the next couple of slides. So I just wanted to chuck this in here because this table kind of shows what typical emissions intensity looks like per kind of industry within the ag sector. And so you can see here that beef generally sits between 11 and 18 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of live weight, while sheep meat sits between 6 and 8. And wool is a little bit higher, between 21 and 28 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. The pie chart on the right, that illustrates the typical distribution of emissions in grazing and pastoral businesses. So this is just to help you understand, a lot of the questions that I get sometimes when I'm delivering these content is, if it's just about, it's a bit hard because it's, we can't really reduce our diesel use on property. But as you can see here, carbon dioxide emissions attributed to diesel use really only makes 10% of your emissions profile. So methane attributed mostly to enteric fermentation, that uncontrollable aspect of the business relatively, is making up most of the emissions profile. Nitrous oxide a little bit from kind of urine and dung, mostly in grazing enterprises, and carbon dioxide a little bit from diesel and some other areas. Yeah, but a higher emissions intensity doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. And the emissions intensity cannot be compared vertically because 1 kilogram of beef is not the same as 1 kilogram of wine, is not the same as 1 kilogram of canola or wheat. And it's just meant to be kind of compared laterally so you can look at how you're doing overall and what area you have, what levers you have to pull in that direction. So the key takeaway here is this: beef, sheep meat, and wool are naturally methane intensive systems because of their rumen and stomach. But within that, there's a lot of room for efficiency gains, and that's where producers have real influence. And we'll talk about those efficiency gains next week. Last thing to understand before we look at the supply chain is scopes 1, 2, and 3. I'm sure some of you have already kind of heard about this, but these scopes really help us to understand who owns the emissions and who's responsible for reporting on them. So we'll start with Scope 1 emissions, and we'll think about it in context of your own property. So these emissions, they're emissions that you own. They're directly related to how you produce your business on your property. So it's within your controls. For a pastoral property, this typically includes enteric methane from your livestock, like we discussed, fuel use, maybe utes, generators, loaders, etc., primarily diesel. On-property energy systems, maybe. That's typically it. I'm sure there's some other areas. Obviously, there's a little bit of fugitive emissions from urine and dung from your livestock, but that's naturally calculated. Even emissions from adjusted animals on your property can fall under Scope 1 if they're under your management at the time. In short, Scope 1 is everything happening within your property fence that you directly manage or control. Scope 2 emissions, this really just covers purchased electricity, which probably isn't very relevant for pastoral stations. Maybe if you're on a smaller property close to a township, you have some of this, but this is relatively, this is one of the easier to manage scopes, because renewable energy, if you have any of this purchased electricity, effectively negates that. Then there's Scope 3, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated from your viewpoint, depending on how you view it. So Scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions that occur up and down the value chain, from the inputs you buy to the transport, processing, and even the end use of your product. For example, trucking of your cattle to process generates emissions, and even the retailer selling your beef, if you're a beef producer, or wool, includes your production footprint in their Scope 3 accounting. So in effect, you are part of someone else's Scope 3 emissions. For example, you are your bank's Scope 3 emissions, and you're also who you supply to Scope 3. This means that while your emissions may be reported by you, they're also counted again further up the chain, and that's intentional. Now, that might sound like a duplication or a double accounting, but Scope 3 double counting, it's by design. It's not about inflating global trends. It's about understanding where emissions occur in the value chain so that every player can identify where they have influence and where they can drive reductions. So let's have a think about Woolworths, for example. We're going to flip it not from your property, but from their perspective. So for Woolworths, their Scope 1 emissions come from their own operations, their delivery trucks, refrigeration systems, and store energy use. Their Scope 2 emissions, and this is more considerable than on pastoral properties, that comes from the electricity they buy to run stores and distribution centres. But their Scope 3 emission, that's where you come in. The emissions from producing beef, lamb, or dairy products they sell are part of your Scope 1, but they become Woolworths Scope 3. That means Woolworths and other major buyers now have a direct interest in understanding and lowering emissions at a property scale, because your numbers affect theirs. This is why data collection, measurement, and transparency is becoming so important. And as the saying goes, you can only manage what you can measure. So I want to kind of bring it back to a bit of a hopefully more local example. So Thomas Foods has been a bit of a leader in this space, and they've done a lot of investigating into where their emissions come from so they can plan how to reduce them by 2050. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit because I think I'm running out of time. So this chart shows TFI's emissions profile for Australia in 2022. And as you can see straight away, almost all of it comes from livestock. That's 96% there. Their own operations, the plants, trucks, and energy make up only a small fraction, but the livestock they purchase and process, that's what the big footprint is. So Mark Inglis, and I'm going to give him a face so that you can know who he is, from TFI summed it up perfectly at the Paraway's Net Zero Better for Business Field Day in 2024. I've pulled this from an article, that's why I've quoted where it's from. So he said, our customers expect the products we sell to be net zero. They don't want to inherit anything. In other words, when global buyers purchase red meat, they're not just looking at TFI's factory emissions, they're looking right back through the supply chain to the property gate. That's a challenge. TFI can only manage its own fuel and energy use, but it can't reach net zero unless it has data from the producers supplying those animals. So to give you a sense of scale, if TFI had to offset all the livestock emissions today at around $30 a tonne per carbon credit, it would cost them around $85 million a year to do so. And as Mark said, do you think we're going to get that back from our customers? Probably not. So he also said that people are searching for a bit of a silver bullet from this space. And this is before all those new targets come out. So maybe this has shifted a little bit. But a solution needs to be practical, affordable, and easy to fit into existing management systems that can deliver deeper cuts. Because at the end of the day, if the solution doesn't work on property, if it's too costly or complex, it won't stick. And the industry knows that. So I just want to highlight this. I'm going to move fairly quickly through this because, yes, like I said, we're getting out of time. But this is just a little bit of a snapshot at what big companies like TFI, like Woolworths, and we're going to look at some of their goals in the next slide, are kind of facing. And there's a lot of regulatory pressure that's happening at both a national and an international scale. This science-based targets, that's kind of more relevant to us here. So this science... that's more relevant to what's happening here. Whereas all of these, they kind of come together and they create a framework that companies that earn above a certain threshold have to report to. And what I want to highlight here is that a lot of the time, if you're getting asked for your emissions numbers or anything like that, it can feel a little bit like, oh my gosh, these companies are kind of on top of it. There's going to be some type of carbon tax or whatever. But I just want to highlight that there's a lot of pressure on these companies and they're kind of asking, how are we going to get there? And Richard Eckard, who's a real leader in this space, has done a lot of development, has said he's had a lot of companies kind of come and knock on his door and ask him, how are we going to accurately track all of this data? Because it is expansive. So processes like TFI, they can't go net zero on their own because, like we said, 96% of their emissions come from the livestock industry. And that's why the industry is investing heavily in measurement tools. So yeah, just wanted to highlight that. So here's a few of the targets that extend beyond just TFI. So Coles and Woolworths, for example, they're already setting net zero. They're already net zero for their own operations and are now working on their Scope 3 targets. JBS Food, which is one of the biggest meat processors in the world, is aiming for net zero emissions by 2040 and has a 30% reduction target by 2030. Then there's the banks. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. A lot of banks have targets, but how they're moving on it, I feel like they're moving a little bit slowly, but they will start to ramp it up because NAB and Rabobank have both committed to net zero finance emissions by 2050. For Rabobank, this isn't just a goal, it's tied to their capital. Being a European bank, their head office in the Netherlands can only allocate funds to sectors that can demonstrate environmental performance. So if they can't report those numbers to the European Central Bank, then they can't lend any money there. So the pressure isn't just from government policy anymore, it's coming from the global financial systems and from buyers who want verified lower emissions products. As we said, a lot of targets are being driven by the consumer, not necessarily by government targets. So the takeaway here is this. Every link in your supply chain from property to processor to retailer to bank is moving towards net zero by 2050. And for producers, good data and strong performance on emissions intensity perhaps will open up doors for better market access, stronger contracts, and even potential financial incentives. Because like I said, producers aren't under the regulatory pressure. It's actually companies like this, and they're going to need your data more than probably you need to give it to them because the world's got to eat. So I'm getting towards the end. We're doing well. I'm going to speed through that. So that's where things are heading. Every part of the supply chain is moving towards net zero. The big question now is, how will the supply chain start buying? What's going to change when processors, retailers, and banks start factoring emissions performance into their purchasing decisions? We'll unpack that next, and then next week we'll go a step further into how you can position your business to take advantage of these shifts. So they get carbon audits done, perhaps, like what TFI has done, and then they simply rank them from lowest emissions intensity up to the highest and start buying accordingly. Because the less carbon credits that companies that you supply to have to buy, the better for them. You can see that the idea here on the slide, each property has a theoretical emissions intensity in how many kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent is produced per kilo of live weight they produce. So in this example, this is sheep meat, and if you recall back to the emissions intensity chart, a sheep has an emissions intensity typically from 6 to 8 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of sheep meat produced. In the past, this kind of conversation has sometimes come across as a bit of a fear-mongering tactic, putting all the pressure back on producers. But I think now that's kind of starting to change with companies like TFI, Woolworths, and other across the supply chain, that they're now taking a bit more ownership in this area. They know it's not a producer problem entirely, it's a shared one, and the real opportunity lies in collaboration. And for producers, this first step, and my last slide, knowing your number is really valuable, and it shows where you stand. It helps you plan improvements and keep you ready as reporting becomes more common. But before we go any further, it's important to be clear, no one's expecting you to be suddenly carbon neutral. Nobody's expecting you to be net zero. And there's no carbon tax coming for you. That's not what this is about. What this really is about is understanding your own footprint so you can make informed decision. On property, emissions look different for every type of operation. There's no one-size-fits-all pattern. Dairy, beef, and grain all have completely different emissions profiles. Even if you look at poultry and pigs, most of their emissions come from manure management, not the animals themselves. In cropping, cotton has higher nitrous oxide from fertilizer, while rice generates more methane from flooded soils and organic matter. And of course, livestock emissions, mainly from the digestion process. So, like I said, every industry has its own pathway to net zero. And so this isn't about unrealistic expectations, it's about starting with good data and building from there. Right, key takeaways, I'm going to fire through this. Net zero is not going away, and being proactive is the best way to stay ahead of the curve. Know your footprint, your total, and your intensity per unit, and start data collection now. Banks, value chain, they're probably going to start gently asking for it because they need 5 years of data. Nobody expects you to be net zero or carbon neutral today. Next week, we're going to be addressing the safeguard mechanism, the carbon credits, and where to be cautious in that area, because there is a few areas that I'd love to address. Practical ways to reduce emissions and boost productivity. We've kind of tiptoed around it. You might have a little bit of ideas, but we'll look into it further next week. And understanding how carbon accounting and its benefits. We're going to explore carbon credits and the nature repair market opportunities, if there are any, and navigate the changing carbon landscape and preparing for the future. So thank you very much. That marks the end of my official webinar. And we'll open up for questions if there's any after all that spiel. I'm going to unmute everyone. Sweet. In the chat. Right. Well, if there's no questions, please feel free to give me a call after this meeting. Oh, have you got a question, Paula?
Yes, Jade, it's not really about your presentation, but is it possible to get a copy of your slides at all or not?
Yeah, I can send them through to you.
That'd be great.
I can also send you the recording as well.
Yes, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
And just to follow up, just from like a additional information kind of situation, I'm going to send through some additional resources, kind of the fact sheet that we created as a resource that cover this, just to tomorrow.